We're going to talk about the evolution of a young earth creationist. So I'm here with Sal Cordova. He's a young earth creationist. I'm a young earth creationist. And I don't think either one of us are very dogmatic about it. It's just what we have come to believe based on our history. So tonight we're going to talk about how did Sal get there? Because Sal, you used to completely believe in evolution. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. I was raised in a Roman Catholic home before becoming an evangelical Christian. And uh, I thought evolution was a beautiful theory. The idea that creatures and everything in the universe would be just getting better and better. I said, that's a beautiful idea. I mean, obviously it was very optimistic. Okay, so I was being taught this in elementary school and high school, and I didn't realize kind of the dark side of the way sometimes evolutionary theories uh, communicated, like the way Richard Dawkins talks about it. So for me, I said, well, I'd like to believe everything's improving and God is behind our improvement. And so for me, um, and especially in the Catholic Church, this was a-okay. And I had Collier's encyclopedia where they showed where this little progression from the warm little pond or whatever in the cover of the book, and then you saw the progression going from creatures that emerged out of the sea, and then they became these apes, and then these I guess like Neanderthal like creatures. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. And I love going through the encyclopedia. Even as a 4-year-old, I love the pictures of, even before I could read, I wanted to look at the pictures in the encyclopedia. So I'd always see that. And then they showed the picture of man becoming, more modern, and then him going out to space. And at the end, he's out in space, and the never-ending adventure. And so this was also a very hopeful time. This was in the 1960s when we were just starting to explore space, and everyone was so excited about humanity's future. And so for me, the evolutionary story of continuous progression and never-ending adventure was just, to me, I embraced it. To me, that was beautiful. And I said, well, I believe in God, and this is consistent with the way I think God would want to do things, So that was my background. I was not raised in a fundamentalist background. My parents, mom, I found out actually much later, she never believed in evolution, but she didn't care. That wasn't the subject of conversations anywhere in our, me growing up. And she had these little books about dinosaurs and volcanoes, which as a 6-year-old, I was just, I loved the pictures and like, this is really cool. So that was about the extent of, the way I was raised up. So if you wanted to ask me more, and we
Well,
can.
yeah. So where did that start to change?
It started to change when I started to study biology in ninth grade. I'd actually skipped a grade in school. They thought I was gifted and talented. And so I was a little bit young for entering high school. And when I took that, I was given the standard Darwinian story, and I had no reason to doubt it. Now, being raised a Catholic, you hear the scriptures, but still, I don't recall that there was much talked about Genesis. So even if they read it to me in one ear, out the other, as a Catholic boy, what you're taught to do is to learn how to pray the prayers and do all the, how to conduct yourself in the Mass, in the Catholic Mass. So as you know, the Catholics really love ceremony, and to this day I love ceremony. So I was there, again, I was sitting there, and I said, okay, so they're giving me this story, and what is this thing about self, the consciousness? I said, how can molecules suddenly become self-aware? Because I feel pain. I said, molecules don't feel pain. And I began to have doubts. And then I did see something about like a movie called The Bible. It wasn't really well executed, and they had Adam and Eve. And I'm like, okay. And at that age, it's like you're throwing these facts. You don't realize that there's an inconsistency. You just like, oh, that's cool. That's cool. Um, uh, and that was when the doubts began. But even then, it wasn't that significant until after I became a Christian in 1978 in high school. I I don't. It's a little foggy, but I think I got a hold of an Institute of Creation Research tract, and they talked about the complexity of life. Now they were actually criticizing abiogenesis, but that was enough for me to say, yeah, this is a miracle. My intuition, and again, I wasn't that committed either way, but it seemed to resonate with me. And there was one guy who visited our high school who criticized evolution. He visited after the regular classroom hours, so it was still permissible for him to talk about whatever. And I was very fascinated by that. And that's basically where I stopped being an evolutionist. I went off to college and became an evangelical, joined the what's now known as the Presbyterian Church of America. Even then, they weren't really pushing creationism. I was like, okay, I believe God created. I believe in long ages. And one of my favorite books was Robert Jastrow's God and the Astronomers. It talked about the Big Bang. And when I nearly lost my faith so many times, that was my go-to book, The Miracles of the Big Bang. And that is still, even though I have now rejected the Big Bang, I'm very grateful for the role it had. And I would say there were a lot of elements to it that are still right, if not in the technical details, in the spirit. So.
I want to offer clarity for people about, you said, when I became a Christian, because a lot of people will hear you say you went from being Catholic, you were already Catholic. So were you not really a believer at that time? Like, what do you mean when you say you became a Christian?
Yeah, of course, my mom gets sometimes a little disconcerted when I've said that. She said, but you were baptized in the Catholic Church. I raised you as a Christian. I was having like a lot of high schoolers, just a lot of typical high school problems. And I was going to mass, and so this is 1978, and I started listening to when they would read the scriptures. And for the first time, I'm just like, I've heard this like a bazillion times, but now why does it resonate? And then there was a Bible, Catholic translation, Good News for Modern Man. It was the New Testament. I started reading it, and it started to resonate with me. And I think there were spiritual forces, honestly. I do have to say, even at age 12, I saw a vision. And to this day, I don't know what the origin of it. It could be a hallucination, or it could really be something spiritual. Now, people who know me, I think there really are spiritual forces out there. And I was into psychic phenomenon and stuff. And so, but it caused a lot of spiritual trouble in me. But as I read the Bible, that something changed. I just felt, one time I was just sitting with a friend in the den of our house, and we were just talking about the end of the world, just a random high school conversation. And suddenly this flood of peace came over. I said, I don't know why not. All the worries have lifted. And my friend said, yeah, I can feel it too. And we were just in that room. All the evil just seemed to lift. And the sky, everything just started to look more beautiful. So I knew something had happened that I couldn't explain. And that was the change. And it was a good change, because once I went off to college, I had even more problems to deal with. And I'm just like, well, it's good to be able to believe in God, even though I had so many doubts about everything.
Okay, so let's talk about, like you said, you were having doubts about everything, and you got a hold of the ICR track.
Yeah.
About abiogenesis. But do you want to talk more about the doubts that you were having at that time?
Absolutely. And it actually has stayed with me for most of my adult life. It's like, yes, I would like to believe in God, but I would like something more than wishful thinking. And I said, if God is real, shouldn't he be as obvious to our senses as the air we breathe? And shouldn't he be as obvious as, like, like I'm talking to a person. I can talk to them, they'll hear me, and they'll respond. Whereas when you pray, you don't hear voices come down from the sky. Yet on the other hand, it really felt like there were answered prayers and miracles in my life. And like I said, I had a vision. And so it's like, well, this. So I was caught. I said, I can't say totally no, and I can't say totally yes. But I still kept going to church, and I said still kept trying to live the Christian life. And so it's only now, toward the very later part of my life, I began to see answers, especially being through a scientific discipline. Most of the fundamental things you study in science that really have changed technology are things you can't directly see, and they're not obvious. And it's because of that I said, okay, I'm more willing to believe something that it doesn't just, pop up in your face. I mean, we have radio waves. We have, the generators. You have these the way a generator works is you have wires, usually copper, that go through these invisible magnetic fields. You cannot directly see them. And so there is still a part of me that said, I don't necessarily have to directly see it, because if you're an electrical engineer, it's the norm. You're not going to see radio waves, but you're engineering them all the time. You're building machines that can produce them and detect them. And I said, okay, I can at least, but they're also the problem of evil and all. But and so it's just in the nature of someone who's empirically driven, like a scientist or engineer, to want facts. And really, I feel the church had failed me in that area. And I was just like, look, I'm really wanting to believe, but all you do is preach. And you never answer my questions. And worse, when I raise a legitimate question, you start to insult me and condemn me, which is actually in violation of the Bible, Jude 1:22. That's not what you do. But there was a culture in evangelicalism then and also today where a lot of belief is enforced by intimidation. I'm sorry to say that, but I've talked to enough evangelicals and I experienced it myself. And so I had a lot of doubts, but it did make me cherish once I started to have those doubts and questions answered, because you begin to value something when you've really had to struggle and to wait for it to come to you.
Yes. And for those interested, the spiritual doubts that Sal was having, a lot of them are discussed on a video that we did together called Cures for a Doubting Thomas, which I love. And we're focusing more on the scientific aspect of it tonight and how you changed your belief about origins. Should I pull up the chart?
Oh, please.
Okay.
Now we can have yeah, there you go.
Yeah. And I asked Sal to come on and do this because I saw this chart that he had made and I loved it so much. And so do you want to just talk about what this chart is about?
Yes, this is my own personal view of things. I'm not speaking for anyone else. So when it says pre-1970, I was just a little kid. And so what was taught in school was, life just sort of popped up. They didn't really even talk about it very much, honestly, in elementary school. And the one time I mentioned God in first grade class, I go to Sunday school, they teach you about God. I go to a public school and I mentioned God made the world, and the teacher gave me that mean look. We don't talk about God here. And that's the first time I was like, oh my, what's this disconnect where God is so important on Sunday, and then in secular elementary school, I can't mention the name God. Even though at the time, let's see, we still had to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance, to the republic which it stands. And there was some mention of God in that pledge.
Yeah, one nation under God.
Yes. And so yeah. I was shocked. In fact, I'm still to this day traumatized as I recall that memory, because that was my first experience where the mention of God, I got that mean look, and you're not welcome here. That was very disturbing. And nowadays I'm kind of used to it. I have a whole cadre of haters, and I actually kind of enjoy that. I mean, at least I get all this attention. So so if you go back to that diagram, so it was like I didn't even know about evolution of complexity. I didn't know universal common ancestry. I didn't know topics that we talk about now, like shared errors and common descent. I thought the universe is billions of years old. And I'm like, that's pretty cool. That's all these long ages. You look up in the sky, it looks so grand. And you're like, yeah, I could believe this was here forever, for billions of years. Something this beautiful and majestic. It's kind of like a picture of God. So I was like, this is really cool. The universe is billions of years old. And, the fossil record, dinosaurs hundreds of millions of years old. And my favorite movie at the time, partly because of Raquel Welch, even though I was a little boy, was 1 million years BC, where you see the guys fighting the dinosaurs. And I'm like, this is really cool. And, I think there was stuff about the solar system and all basically old Earth, old universe. And that's what I was taught. It was in the encyclopedias that mom and dad bought for the family, and there was just like no big deal. To be a good Catholic, you just had to do the ceremonies. So then in the 1970s, that's when I was like in second, third, fourth grade, all the way up to high school. Early on, I was watching Jacob Bronowski's in junior high, and they said the Urey Miller experiment. This is how life started. You had the lightning, and you had the little whatever experiments, and they said, and then Jacob Bronowski was showing all these evolutionary fossils. But like I said, toward like close to the 1980s, very late. So you see that bar where it's not quite so red. So red, by the way, just interpret. Red means we don't believe in any of this young Earth creationism. No evidence.
So this is like red is like evolution,
old Earth,
ages, everything. Yeah.
But toward the end of the 1970s, I began to think, oh, this is when I became a Christian. And this is almost 1980. And the ICR tract, very influential. It's like, look, the improbabilities are just astronomical. And I said, even though I wouldn't make that argument today, even as a, someone who studied this at a professional level, it was good enough for someone that age. Just the idea of complexity. And so then there was a doubt. That was when I stopped believing in abiogenesis. But, again, I was still somewhat of an evolutionist. I mean, I'm just a high school kid. You don't really think about these grand questions. It's like, okay. Anyways, it's like, okay, you think about it, and then it's like, oh, there's something else in high school that you're just going to focus on, that you don't think about these things like we might hear on this channel. And then so in 1980, I learned about the Big Bang, Robert Jastro's book, God and the Astronomers. I wish I had the copy of it here. It is a cherished book. But at that point, I said, look, I don't believe in evolution anymore. It's just too complex. And so that was really my life until I got to the 1990s. And
and where is it turning green there? Like, which thing is turning green? Miracle needed for evolution. Okay.
No, abiogenesis, 1980.
Yeah, right. No, but I mean for evolution. So it was in the 90s. You were still fully believing in the long ages of Big Bang and everything like that. Okay.
Yes. So in the 1990s, as I was an engineer, I began first, I really didn't know much about evolutionary theory and Darwinism. And being a computer science student, you learned about evolutionary algorithms. So you began to start to think like the way Darwinism is advertised. And I'm like, no, these evolutionary algorithms are designed, first of all. I mean, they don't just happen. And I said, you can't apply that to the way things work in biology. And then, I don't know, just maybe intuitively, I knew something was just like, no, this doesn't work. You know, they'll say, well, look, it obviously selects for this because without it, you die. And I'm just like, well, no, there's a little problem with that. Because without it and you die means that when it wasn't there to begin with, you're dead. There's no evolution. I'm like, dude, guys, not get that, you know? and so even though that wasn't the most sophisticated argument, at that time, I was an engineer in the aerospace and defense industry. I had already gotten my computer science degree, and I was working on two more degrees with 2 minors in mathematics, electrical engineering, and minors in physics and music. And I was trying to start a business. And so, again, it wasn't really the focus like we focus on it now. But I began to have doubts about evolution. And then if you can go back to the graph. So come 2000, I began to have these questions again about my Christian faith. And I was going through a lot of questions about life. You know, what's the mean? I mean, when you get to this age, I think I probably was about age 30 at that time. And I began to think, you know, what are the big questions of life? What you know, you begin to just search. And I said, you know, I don't completely believe everything the pastor says. And the Bible's really hard to read. And I don't like a lot of the things that I read in the Bible. There's so much violence in the Old Testament. And it's like, I don't know what to do with this. And I started, you know, around that time, Dad started, he became terminally ill. There's some sort of pulmonary issue, the lungs. And you just begin to question everything. It's like, God, why is all this bad happening? And we did cover that one time in one of our discussions about Heather Mercer. She was a missionary to Afghanistan, and she got captured, and they're going to execute her. And I'm like, God, this doesn't make sense. You're supposed to help your people. And the other thing I said, what if all of this Christianity is just a sham to make us feel better about everything? What if it's nothing more than wishful thinking? I could still believe in God, but maybe, I don't know, maybe he's really distant. Maybe he really just doesn't care anymore, because I'm praying that Dad would recover and he's not recovering. And then I'm praying for Heather Mercer and things don't seem to be working out. And I'm like, okay, I just don't get it. And then in church culture, Nancy Pearcey, by the way, wrote the book Saving Leonardo. She pointed out, evangelical churches are great atheist factories. I'm like, yeah, I could tell you that, because a lot of the atheists that I deal with are ex-evangelicals, and I could see the bitterness of what they went through. I really do sympathize with them, because, you know, as a scientist and an engineer, asking questions are welcome. I go to church and I got that, you know, kind of that wagging look. And ironically, now that I think about it, that reminds me about when I was that little 6-year-old boy in first grade class, and I brought the topic of God, and the teacher gave me that look. We don't talk about God here. And so now I'm in church, we talk about God, but it's like, no, we don't question, you don't ask for evidence of God here. That's not welcome. So I was just in a crisis of faith. So that was 2001. And I said, okay, I don't believe the Bible anymore. I've kind of hung on as a Christian, and I'm ready to ditch it. It's like I don't hate Christianity. And around that time, I was taking voice lessons. I love to sing. I'm a musician. I really wanted to be a musician before I devolved into an engineer. I'm sorry. My voice teacher, she was I would have never thought this. She was suffering muscular dystrophy, so she's wheelchair bound. The most beautiful human being, though. And I said, Gwen, so we'd have my voice lesson, and we just sometimes talk. Uh, and I said, Gwen, I'm sorry to tell you this. I'm studying science, and I don't think I think I might be leaving the Christian faith. And she looked at me. She said, well, where are you going to go? I'm like, she has a point. Where am I going to go? I don't believe any of the other religions. And I said, well, I could just try to live it up, as it says in Corinthians, if Christ is not raised, then your faith is in vain. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And I said, well, I could do that, but what if it is real? I said, what if there's a small chance? And I didn't realize Gwen was basically echoing what was written in John 6:64, I think. Jesus turned to his apostles and said, are you going to leave? Peter said, well, who else has words of eternal life? And so I had that little spark. I said, I have all these questions. They haven't been answered for 30 years, but hey, why not? Why don't I continue to give it a shot? I don't have anything better to do, honestly. I mean, secular humanism did not appeal to me. I could see the devastation it had on entire cultures like the Soviet Union and communist China. I said, I want no part of that. And I said, the idea of a God still very much appeals to me. So I do have, as an anecdote, I didn't like being treated as if I hated God. It's like, you hate God, that's why you're asking questions. I'm like, no, that's exactly why I'm asking questions. I need assurance that he's real. So I'm sorry, you could tell that I've had a lot of bitter experiences in church, and it still affected me to this day. So I said, okay, what can I do? I'll just start from scratch. All I have is my scientific training. I have some mathematics. I know physics. So by that time, I had 3 bachelor's degrees: computer science, electrical engineering, minor in music, mathematics, minor in physics from George Mason University.
Okay, and we're at the orange part on the chart.
Yes.
So we're all orange, so you're not believing in anything related to origins right now.
I began to slip. See that orange means I went through a phase of doubt. Question everything.
Yeah.
But that wasn't, I began questioning what I thought about, I learned from the ICR. And so this was also difficult. But that questioning phase was very important, because that was also starting to lead to my healing. So I was going back and forth, but then this time I was going to be much more rigorous. And maybe I could amend the chart now, looking and reflecting, because it really, it says 2010, but I would say by about 2007, I started to believe, because in 2005, I was on the cover of Nature talking about intelligent design. So there's a mistake on the chart. It really should more say 2005 when I...
Oh, for the dark green?
Right, exactly.
Because you're green in 2005. Oh, you're saying it should say 2005 for the light green.
Yes. And that's a mistake on the chart. By the way, I mean, we slapped this chart together. I slapped it together some years ago, and it wasn't that rigorous, but I was in a rush to put it together. But so if now that we're talking about it, I'd like the viewers to know that this has to be amended, because obviously I would by 2002, 2003, I started to recover, and I wanted to tell the story to everyone. There's a designer. I was not totally convinced as a young Earth creationist, but I said evolutionary theory is wrong. Definitely abiogenesis is it's been refuted. And that's been reaffirmed by all the stuff James Tour is saying, and even now some of the research that I'm trying to contribute to the field with statistical mechanics. And I'm just like, I do remember, if I may give just a spiritual anecdote, I was at the end of my rope. I went to my prayer group and said, look, I don't have the strength to believe. You just can't force yourself to believe something. That's self-brainwashing, that's self-delusion. I said, that's just not me. I'm ready to cut out. But I did read, and I was reading in James, he who prays that has a doubt, don't expect you'll be heard. I'm like, that's kind of tough, because I need faith. How am I going to get this? Because for you to answer my prayer, I need faith. But I said, well, there was a loophole. James 5:16, confess your faults before one another so that you may be healed. So I went to the group. I said, look, I'm ready to leave. Can you pray for me? And that was the first time that I didn't get condemned. They said, we love you, Sal. Be with us. We're praying for you. And so from about 2001 to 2004, I began reading all these books on intelligent design and stuff on abiogenesis. And I'm like, this resonates with everything I've learned, with all the mathematics, the physics, and even the little chemistry I knew. I said, this totally makes sense. Abiogenesis is absolute nonsense, because I have actually thought how to build systems that what they call self-reproducing von Neumann automata, which basically is a robot that can make another robot from scratch. I said, that's a really hard problem. But yet life does it all the time. I said, the sophistication needed to do this, because we were interested in it, because I was in the aerospace industry. We had some thoughts had come about, like, couldn't we just send robots to other planets and let them build out the civilization there, so when we arrive, we have all these factories and homes and environments we could live in. And so this thought had come to my mind. I said, this is a gargantuan problem, but life is a solution to that problem. So where did the design come from? It's like, look, all doubt is gone at this point. There is a God now. I don't understand the problem of evil and all these other things, and I don't understand the Bible, and I don't completely believe the Bible, but goodness, this is really compelling. And then somewhere around there, Michael Behe actually visited George Mason University. And I'm like, who's he? And can I give one personal anecdote?
You can give as many personal anecdotes as you want. This is this whole thing is your experience, so please.
Well, I want to make sure it's compelling to your readers. But okay, I'll give you the anecdote. So Michael Behe, I think it was probably around, he's going to, not too long after he published Darwin's Black Box. And it was a big deal. I said, we're going to invite Michael Behe. It packed out auditorium. And I had asked this girl, I said, hey, Jean, how would I take you out to dinner for your birthday? And that was on the schedule. And then, unfortunately, it conflicted with Michael Behe coming. I called her up. I said, I'm sorry, I have to cancel, but Michael Behe's coming. She never forgave me for that. That relationship didn't work out. But to me, that was more important. I see Michael Behe. She took it so personally that I didn't take her out to dinner for her birthday. I'm sorry about that, Jean. She married a fine guy. So, but I'm just, if anything that communicates, this is how important this was to me. This is how important this question was. I said, I want reassurance that God is there. I don't know how I'm going to get it, but this really is, at a personal level, my life will make sense. And so Michael Behe came, and that's the first time I met him. I was so thrilled. To this day, he knows who I am. I never told him that story, though. But anyway, so that was around 2000. Maybe it was actually earlier. I don't remember. It was probably maybe even the 1990s that I heard that. And maybe it just kind of stuck with me as I was going through my doubts. So anyway, I was recovering from my doubts. And I said, this relates to the prayer when all these people prayed for me in 2002 that I wouldn't lose my faith. I said, well, a deal's a deal. If God gives me the evidence, I have an obligation to share it with other people, because he's healed me. Now I have a responsibility to heal other people who want to be healed. There are plenty who don't, but there are those. I said, it would be wrong of me just to go on with my life. and not try to do something. Now, at the time, I was planning to start my business. I said, look, I'll give 1 year of my life to promote intelligent design, and then I'm just going to do my own thing after that. All right, Lord? And so in 2004, in the fall, I said, God, I'm going to make this intelligent design group on campus. And I don't know, I was praying with, her name was Christy. She and I were just going to start this group at George Mason. I said, God, I'd like national attention. I don't know why it came to my mouth. When we were just about to submit the paperwork for our little intelligent design group, 3 months later, I get a call from a reporter from the prestigious scientific journal Nature. I said, why would they want to talk to me? And not only did I get national attention, I got international attention. And it turned out that there was a scandal at George Mason. The reason they wanted to come to George Mason is like, this seemed to be like an epicenter of some dissension going on. And it was disturbing people that professors, not just students, but professors now are starting to think ID. I need to tell the audience this. This is very interesting. At George Mason, there are 3, George Mason has awarded 4 PhDs to creationists. 3 of them are in biology. Gordon Wilson, you can check this out. Gordon Wilson, Timothy Standish, and Timothy Brophy. And Charles Jackson, who gets kind of, usually the punching bag of evolutionists. He got his he and I went to school at George Mason. He eventually became he got his doctorate in education at University of Virginia or something. He's in the Creationist Hall of Fame. Also, David McQueen was a professor at George Mason. He's a young earth creationist. He's a professor of geology. Then Carolyn Crocker.
So George Mason was having an issue because there were even some professors that believed in creation or intelligent design. How did that heat up?
Carolyn Crocker was
Carolyn
Crocker was removed by a disgruntled student who reported her as talking about intelligent design. It was just in passing. She was giving a class on cellular biology, and she felt it was her academic responsibility to say, okay, the textbooks tell you this evolved, but here's other evidence. And the student who reported her was flunking out of school, reported her to the upper faculty, and they removed her in the middle of the semester. You're not teaching. And then they didn't renew her contract. They didn't say she was fired. They just giving, like they normally do. They'll just not renew your contract. You're essentially fired, but then they'll give you a glowing review just to clean up the paper trail. This had nothing to do, this was a budgetary decision or something like that. She sued the university. Edward Sisson was her attorney. And it turned out the law firm that Sisson worked for actually had, he didn't know it at the time, apparently. I'm just guessing here, that it had a commercial matter with George Mason. George Mason said, look, law firm, there's a lawsuit against us by one of your attorneys. So they fired the attorney and they played tough, and that was the end of the lawsuit. And then Carolyn Crocker ended up expelled. This is also around the time Richard Sternberg, PhD, evolutionary biologist, got in a lot of hot water because he was editor of a journal, and he let Stephen Meyer publish and mention the word intelligent design. He lost his job. There's a congressional investigation. They're firing Bill Dembski at Baylor. They're pressuring Walter Bradley and Robert Marks down in Baylor. At Iowa, they were going after Guillermo Gonzalez. It's just like there was a witch hunt all over the country at that time with intelligent design. And that was also 2005 when I was on the cover of Nature. That's when Kitzmiller-Dover was being decided and argued in court. And so this was a big deal. 2005 was a big year for intelligent design. They thought that there was this book, Creationism's Trojan Horse. So there was this big, the boogeyman of creationism is coming back, and they're going to, it's going to be this, it's part of their plan, the master plan to create a theocracy in the United States. And I was just laughing. You had people who actually believe that. And so that was the climate I was in. And so all these people here that, the faculty and even their PhD students. Now, at the time, they didn't know those PhD students probably were young Earth creationists, the three that I mentioned. And in addition to that, George Mason had three professors, one of them pretty distinguished, Minas Kafatos, Cesar Roy, and his brother, also like Malibat, I can't pronounce his name, Roy, who publicly said, we disagree with the Big Bang. And then my professor, James Treffel, kind of halfway disagreed. So there was something in the water of George Mason University out there in Fairfax County, which is the largest public university.
Was it free thinking, maybe?
Yeah.
Free thinking, academic environment? Wow.
I mean, so I'm like, look, so you have these creationists graduating here. You're George Mason is then punishing a professor of biology for questioning Darwinism. And I'm like, okay, you have to notice. And then you have professors questioning the Big Bang. You're like, this is really, on some level, this is actually kind of thrilling. And then
so did you start to question the Big Bang because your professors were questioning the Big Bang, or not yet?
It was slightly before that, because I saw stuff by Walter Brown. And I'll tell you what really did it for me. So when I was going through my doubts, I did start to study, and I have stacks of books here. But I did start to study all sorts of ideas. So I was still an old Earth creationist. But then I came across this book, Solar System Evolution. And in the book, he says, his purpose was to fight creationism. He was so upset with it. And he's a National Academy member. He's a geologist. But he said, I'm just going to compile all the evidence we have for solar system evolution. And the funny thing is, you'll see this book. When I went to the ICR, a lot of the scientists had this book on their bookshelf. And I said, yeah, I know why. Because what happened to me probably happened to you. After I read this book, and they were saying, this is an acute, unsolved problem, how this planet could have this feature, or how it could have this feature. I'm just like, so your purpose was to persuade me that the solar system evolved? I think you've done a really, really good job of persuading me it probably could have been created. And you've had that experience. You're reading evolutionary biology books. When they're not propagandists, but try to at least be honest, they'll have these admissions that just pop out at you. You're like, were you trying to tell me evolution's true, and now you're telling me you have all these problems? So this was around 2002, 2003. I was reading this book, and I was like, oh my goodness, you've turned me at least into halfway a creationist. I still may believe in long ages, but I think it's a miracle that the solar system could be there. I had enough physics to know at that time, it's like I could totally see the problems you're describing, because as a student of physics, these would be legitimate questions and problems, and maybe there's no solution except a miracle. So then it really did catch my eye. One of the things I learned at that time was this variable speed of light theory. And someone said, yeah, Treffel over there at George Mason, he'd studied some of that. He was my PhD advisor at the University of Virginia. I said, Treffel? He works here at George Mason University. And so I'm like, okay, so I'm studying at George Mason, and they're teaching the Big Bang, and then you find out professors don't believe it. Of course, you're going to be curious. And so even Dr. Treffel, who was a big advocate of dark matter, if I could share this passage, because creationists cite it, and I alerted him to it. He later said, man, I didn't I didn't mean to give fodder to the creationists. He has this chapter, The 5 Reasons Galaxies Can't Exist. This is so funny. So this is Dr. Truffle, the dark side of the universe. He taught supplementary quantum mechanics and relativity, which I took. He has his autograph here. He autographed my book at the end of class. He said it was to Salvador Cordova. It's been great having you in class, James Truffle. And so he has this chapter, The 5 Reasons Galaxies Can't Exist. And let me read this to you. We can summarize the modern view of the universe in 2 brief statements. First, the universe has been expanding ever since it was formed, and in the process, he's evolved from simple to complex structures. Second, the visible matter in the universe is organized hierarchically. The stars grouped into galaxies, galaxies into clusters, and clusters into superclusters. The problem we face then is to understand how a universe whose evolution is dominated by the first statement could become one whose structure is described by the second. The problem of explaining the existence of galaxies has proved to be one of the thorniest in cosmology. By all rights, they shouldn't be there, yet there they sit. I'm like, dang, dude, now you got my attention. This is from a professor in my class. He obviously believes in the Big Bang, but I'm just like, okay, you really got my attention. And just before that, he also gave a table of how much he believed the Big Bang. And you could see it here. He gave kind of his qualitative, I think 99% probability that's true. And then there are all these other problems. And of course, this would catch my attention. I'm like, he's a beloved professor. Can I read you a passage?
Oh, yes.
Go ahead and ask a question, Rebekah.
No, was this the guy who wrote he said, I'm going to write down my predictions for after I die. It's the same guy?
He's the one who talked about the other guy who wrote that. So I'll read this to you.
Okay. Oh, that's about what you were. That's what you were.
Yes, that's what I was about to do. So there is this also book. I have so many books here. I'm just like you, Rebekah. There's this book called Extinction by David Rout. He was a colleague of Stephen Jay Gould. Bad genes or bad lucks. And so he's excellent. And so Dr. Truffle will talk about Dr. Rout.
Okay.
So what are the odds? And in that section, what are the odds? In the winter and spring of 1986, I had the privilege of spending a sabbatical leave working with a paleontology group at University of Chicago. I was working on the problem of mass extinctions. What killed the dinosaurs? And the visit gave me a chance to get acquainted with David Rout, the leader of the group. Dave has been described as the most brilliant paleontologist in the world, an evaluation that after a period as his collaborator I think is well deserved. He is also one of those rare individuals who get tremendous enjoyment from everything they do. He loves to question things that everyone else accepts without question, a trait that I suspect has a lot to do with his success as a scientist. He's also a terrific card player, as I learned to my sorrow at some late night poker sessions, and spent some of his spare time at his personal computer trying to find a way to beat the system at blackjack. I mentioned these things as background to what I want to tell you about. Something that happened during my visit with the group. We were in Dave's office discussing something or other when he turned to me and asked, right out of the blue, what are the odds that the Big Bang is correct? That brought me up short, as you can imagine. My first impulse was to say, of course it's correct. But I suspected he'd ask me how I knew, so I paused. The more I thought about the question, the more fragments of memory floated into my mind. I recalled a bag lunch in a prestigious physics department when a prominent senior member of the faculty, I wouldn't dream of embarrassing him by mentioning his name, said that he often thought of leaving a sealed envelope to be opened 50 years after his death. In the envelope would be predictions about the way certain scientific controversies would turn out. At the top of the list would be the prediction that the interpretation of the redshift as evidence for universal expansion, which is the Big Bang, would turn out to be wrong. And that was my professor who gave the account of my physics professor, James Trefle, talking about some anonymous guy. So what do you think of that, Rebekah?
That's amazing. And hey, we might be on the verge of it.
He's a distinguished professor. Again, this is James Trefle, but it's in another book. He said, if I were a religious man, I would say that everything we have learned about life in the past 20 years shows that we are unique and therefore special in God's sight. Wow. So people, people might peg me to be like a religious fundamentalist. I'm giving you how this happened. You cannot, if any science student had been through like what I've been through, you could totally see it's like, okay, you're hearing professors starting dissent. You're seeing them kind of quashed for their dissent, sometimes pretty forcefully. And then you're hearing stuff like this. What are you going to think?
But how did that bring you to a positive on young Earth? Because there might even be people watching this who've never even heard of young Earth creationism, and it sounds kind of crazy. Like it just sounds like flat Earth or something like that, right? So how did you go from, where you were starting to say, okay, my professors are questioning the Big Bang. I'm questioning a lot of this stuff.
There was a book.
How did you get to, young Earth?
Okay, so in 2000, okay, so you can even see where I am now in 2020. Actually, I probably made this graph around 3 or 4 years ago. You could see that there are some things that I'm not putting in the green category. And I've gone back and forth on some of these. And so it's like, okay, maybe tomorrow I might not have exactly these colors. So definitely I think things were created, and there's a miracle of God. It's now the age of the earth. So there's a book written by an agnostic named Richard Milton, Shattering the Myths of Darwinism. Shattering the Myths of Darwinism. So you could take this down. And I'm like, gee, so there are people there who are not young Earth creationists. They're not creationists, but they're beginning to question the age of things. And that caught my attention. Then I did begin to say, okay, what might persuade me that the Earth is young? So again, because I read Solar System Evolution and I said, the solar system's created, I said, everything's now on the table. Everything's on the table. Around that time, John Sanford wrote the book Genetic Entropy. 2004 it was published. I wasn't working for him at the time, but I said, when I looked at his qualifications, I said, a scientist this senior, his invention is in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. He's famous, and he's a Cornell research professor, and he's a creationist. I said, what's going on here? And he's saying, look, we couldn't have been around that long. There's a passage in what he wrote. He quoted an evolutionary biologist by the name of Alexei Kondrashov, who is one of Eugene Koonen's staff members. And just for the record, for information, I studied under one of his other staff members. So I actually studied bioinformatics under evolutionary biologists. So it's not like I'm totally in the blind on these matters. So Kondrashov said, why aren't we dead 100 times over? I said, that's a good question. Because an axiom you'll hear me, a saying that you'll hear me say from now on, it's easier to break than to make. It's so much easier for things to go wrong. And we're seeing this. And I'm just like, yeah, I think it's only a matter of time people start to wonder. It's like, how are we? When you have so much complexity, that just means more places things can go wrong. And without getting into the details of population genetics, they began to realize, well, gee, if we're this complex as we suspect, then evolution is wrong. That's why Dan Graer said in 2012, when ENCODE said 80% of the genome is functional, he said, well, if ENCODE is right, then evolution is wrong. But even before that, I'm like, I could kind of sense this. And I said, well, this would make sense. And then mitochondrial Eve. The other thing was I began reading how did the fossil record come about? And I'm like, yeah, rapid burial. And I looked at the strata and I'm just like, okay, I argued with geologists, but I said, so how does something fossilize? And they said, well, you need water and it has to be rapid burial. And I'm just like, okay, I'm starting to think Noah's flood is feasible. There's still, to this day, I would argue there's still problems with it. And we've had some of your guests that would totally disagree with me. I'm just like, look, these problems aren't going away. I also began to look at racemization. And now I am, because I studied physics, I know I'm learning, I had to study statistical mechanics and stuff like now I'm learning about how to apply that to the idea of configurational entropy, which affects our physical chemistry and chemical physics. And it's like, okay, so when something dies, there are clocks. I mean, it just doesn't stay preserved forever, and we can track. And I looked at this thing. This is before we discovered dinosaur soft tissue. I started to look at these fossils that had incomplete racemization. It's a clock. When something dies, the amino acids that are all left-handed, they start to become 50-50 right and left. This is a known phenomenon. And there was a lot of studies on this, and it caught my attention that they said, well, this isn't reliable because these fossils are obviously millions of years old, and yet they look kind of young. So there's probably some contamination or something wrong. I said, well, there's one possibility you're not really willing to consider, is it? That they could be young. And then I actually did a study of this. I said, well, let's just assume they all died at the same time. What would the plot look like if we were just assigning random dates? And perhaps I could bring up that picture of Dr. James Carter. Okay. If you could see my cursor moving around, I'm sorry that I'm not going to get into the technical things of what this means. However, I will point out, I said, if all these fossils died at the same time, and then they're fixing these ages randomly, the plot of the amount of amino acids in them would follow this plot. And I'm like, you guys just probably made up all these dates. You don't even realize it. And it's a little bit more complicated. I need to rework this, but I saw this. And I'm not going to delve into it because it is pretty involved. But I saw that. I said, you can't run away from the data. I said, the chemical dates are saying one thing, your radiometric dates and your other fossil dating things are wrong. And I said, look, I mean, I wouldn't say wrong. There is a unexplained anomaly there. And then I brought this up and people were just saying, you're stupid, you're uneducated, blah, 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 which is normally what they would say anyway. But also at that time, I said, I never got treated that way when I talked to my professors if I were trying to figure out something. They treated me like I was a bright, intelligent, inquisitive person. But when I bring up these questions, man, they just pounce. I said, this reminds me of church. You ask uncomfortable questions, they just start wagging their head. I'm like, this feels like church, where you do not question doctrine and orthodoxy. I said, I think I went from one church to another where facts don't really count, but ideology takes priority. The other thing was, and I shared this with you, and it was really funny, in solar system evolution, they said it's really amazing. All these planetary rings shouldn't be there. They're all decaying at the same time. We're just in a lucky time, because they're going to disappear. So like they all appeared at the same time relatively recently. I'm just like, that does not prove of young Earth, but the comets would decay. The comets came around the same time. All these planetary rings just somehow conspired. You had billions of years for the solar system to evolve. Why did they evolve rings all of a sudden? And comets at the same time. And then you're making out these funny stories called like the Oort cloud. And I started to see this. I said, look, time out, guys. You seem really, any other venue that didn't have metaphysical implications, you'd say, well, that's an interesting theory. It could be wrong, but hey, why don't we pursue it? Why don't you go ahead and pursue it? But instead, no, you get the wagging. You're stupid. You're whatever. And because I'd seen what they did to Carolyn Crocker when she would actually raise very legitimate questions about evolutionary biology, I said, that almost makes me more excited because you're treating me like I found something you don't like me discovering.
And they just want to silence you.
Yes.
And the way they're going to do that is by calling you a liar or stupid, uneducated, something like that, right? So
exactly. And I said, dude, I wanted to tell, I tried to be, I had a little bit of self-doubt, but a lot of that started to go. I said, I'm more educated, more intelligent than a lot of my critics. I know that sounds really arrogant and mean, but I'm like, well, I am. I'm sorry. It's like, you don't talk to me like that. You don't like the fact that I may have discovered something that grates against the way you view the world. And I actually started to get thrilled. I said, this is probably something valuable. I feel like such a rebel and renegade. I said, this is starting to be fun. And okay, so it's like, on some level, this wasn't totally about religious motivations. This was just like, I think this is like climbing Mount Everest, just because it's so fun to be such a renegade and to know that you have a lot more facts on your side than they're willing to give you credit for.
Now, do you still feel like there are a lot of problems for the young Earth view? Like, do you still think of it very tentatively, or do you think most of the issues with the idea of young Earth have been solved?
I do not think they've been solved. I know that because I'm at creationist conferences and I see guys throwing out models and arguing. I said, okay, we don't have that problem with abiogenesis. We don't have that problem with certain other things in creationism, but okay, so the main things are distant starlight. So I went to graduate school. I studied general relativity and quantum mechanics there, and then cosmology. And when I went to cosmology class in like 2012, that was an interesting. So I was like 75% YEC, maybe 50. I don't know.
That's young Earth creation for those.
Young Earth creationism. So now I was leaning on all this. I said, but the problem is distant starlight, Maxwell's equations. You have the formula will give you the speed of light. And I said, Maxwell's equations, written by a Christian creationist, James Clerk Maxwell. I said, look, speed of light is constant. So much physics depends on that. And if the stars are really far away, how do you resolve that? Well, I went to cosmology class, and I might even have my book here. Yes. So I had background in relativity, and then I took this class. And so I got to read you something interesting. It's like, okay, first thing, page 17 on this book, when we talk about miracles. It said during the 1950s and 1960s. Okay, this is graduate level cosmology after you take relativity at Johns Hopkins University. The year that I graduated, Adam Rees won the Nobel Prize. So this is like no mean school. He was a professor at our school. He won the Nobel Prize in physics on dark energy. And so this is really funny. My professor, and I will not name him, he said, I'm not really sure Adam Rees is right. And of course, that's going to catch your attention. But in this cosmology book, during the 1950s and 1960s, the Big Bang and steady state models battled for supremacy. Critics of the steady state model pointed out that the continuous creation of matter violates mass energy conservation. That's the first law of thermodynamics. Violating the first law of physics. But they built the model that violates the first law of physics. Supporters of the steady state model pointed out that the continuous creation of matter is no more absurd than the instantaneous creation of the entire universe in a single Big Bang. And I was like, wow. And I thought creationists were absurd. And then later, if you had a comment, later on, I learned about inflation. They had all these problems to make the Big Bang work. And we don't have to get into the technical stuff of it, but inflation, galactic amounts of matter, large amounts of matter being thrown around. Well, the proper term is space is being inserted. However you frame it, it's going to be, they're moving at relative to each other thousands of times faster than the speed of light. I'm like, okay, just write a new law of physics, break a few laws like energy conservation, write a few new laws of physics that you can't prove just to fix your model.
And call it a scientific theory.
And I'm like, gee, and I thought young earth creationism was outrageous. And then they talk about multiple universes. I'm like, okay, so if there's multiple universes, maybe there is a universe out there where the young earth creationists are right. Maybe we live in that universe. I said, look, if you're going to invoke something like multiple universes, then young earth creation, we could be living in a universe where young earth creationists are right. How is what I'm learning in cosmology any more outrageous than young earth creationism? You're invoking miracles, you're calling them singularities, and then you're changing the laws of physics, just saying, well, these are amendments. And then you have all these absurd problems that you can't prove, you can't test, and you appeal to multiple universes to explain some fine-tuning. I'm like, how is that more outrageous than young earth creationism? I said, hey, look, whether it's true or not, I think I'm going to go with this. It's no more outrageous than any of the stuff that you're saying that you believe that you can't prove. And so I said, okay, one thing you asked, I talked about the distant starlight problem. Well, some people didn't like inflation theory. And you could look this up. So some secular scientists started proposing variable speed of light theories. I'm like, now that's interesting. So when a young earth creationist suggests it, he's crank. This is garbage. The secular scientist says it. Oh, this is very respectable. That's a very interesting, hypothesis. We should not write it off the table. This is exciting. New frontiers of physics. And then now they're talking about modified Newtonian dynamics to explain the spirals and galaxies and all sorts of things. I'm just like, okay. So when young earth creationists invoke miracles, which, maybe the polite word is call it singularities, because that's what the Big Bang uses. And when they, have to appeal to bent laws of physics, it's like, oh no, that's crank. But you do that for cosmology. Hey, anything's game. This is so exciting. It gets reported in the popular press. And I said, there's a double standard here. That's because young earth creationism has metaphysical implications, doesn't it? And that's what this is really about. And a lot of evolutionary biologists would be out of their job. I love evolutionary. Some of them are switching sides. I know some evolutionary biologists that are young earth creationists now. Okay, so, but I began to see this. So we still have the problem with distant starlight. And I've worked on some interferometry laser experiments to try to look at that inconclusive results. The other thing is the heat problem. There are other problems, and you've had guests that have talked about some of those, and I'm just like, look, they're not completely resolved. It's not like abiogenesis where someone will say, hey, we think we solved the problem of abiogenesis. Of course, James Tour will just hammer them. It's not that way with geological or physics things. The heat problem and accelerated nuclear decay. But while I was at Hopkins, I needed to save my grade at a solid state physics class. And I said, I'm going to gamble. I'm going to give the most outrageous thing about nuclear mechanisms of chemical and electrical means of changing nuclear structure. I said, either the professor will love it or he's going to float me out of the class. As I gambled, but I said, well, I came to Johns Hopkins to learn physics and maybe just, explore and maybe contribute to see if young earth is really feasible. Because now that I've heard all this stuff about cosmology, I'm just like, yeah, I'm game now. Let's go for it. I went to the Hopkins library. I think it's the Eisenhower Library on their main campus for 2 days. And I was going through all the experiments and my jaw dropped. I said, they're able to use electricity to change nuclear structure. Even lightning strikes create neutrons, antimatter, and isotopes. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. We found out that tectonic, like earthquakes, generate lots of electricity, a piezoelectric effect. I said, at least we have a mechanism. Now you can have all that electricity. You could change nuclear structure. But recently, the thing that caught my attention was there's been a persistent theme of very qualified chemists who think they're seeing transmutation, changes of nuclear structure under chemical means. By the way, in my search at Johns Hopkins, I found all this other evidence of credible, respected experiments, like particularly the exploding wire experiments, where you send a lot of electricity through it. You create changes in nuclear structure. I presented that. We were all required to make a term paper in my solid state physics class. He said, but anything you want to talk about. And so I presented on chemical, electrical means of changing nuclear structure. He said, that was the topic of the night. Professor loved it. He gave me the B in the class. I didn't flunk. I didn't get an A, but I got a B. And I'm like, this is really kind of exciting. And so in 2000, you knew this, we've had conversations. It's not anything secret. I went down to Baylor to explore all of these things more. And because I was invited to a PhD program there by Dr. Robert Marks. By the way, there is when I went down to Baylor, he said, Sal, I want to find out more about blackjack. He had me record 5 shows on Mind Matters AI, a Discovery Institute sponsored or endorsed podcast. You'll find 5 episodes of me talking with the distinguished professor of electrical engineering about how to beat the casinos. It's so funny. I was like, okay. But I went down there and I just wanted to learn more about all these things. And around that time, I learned about the Army Corps of Engineers is getting a large grant to explore nuclear transmutation at low energies, which they had used to call cold fusion, but there's so much baggage, we try not to use that term. This naval space warfare systems spent money, and also NASA Glenn Research, and they're finding low energy nuclear transmutation. There is a possibility then that we might solve all the, the parent-daughter product ratios, as you had the engineer, Dr. Houts, the nuclear engineer, and he was talking about changing nuclear decay rates. Well, we might actually be able to affect that chemically and electrically. We don't even need something like, I did appreciate when you sent me the neutrino laser that can change nuclear decay rates. We may not even have to go that far. And I have shared on my channel, I said, this is really compelling. And you could have a simple mechanism. There was a case in Italy where they're compressing rocks and they got nuclear transmutation. It was a big scandal because people said that's stupid. And I'm like, maybe you need to revisit this. And so some very respected scientists are having these experiments. And like, look, you can't ignore this. Maybe it competes with the orthodoxy that likes to build, billion-dollar fusion reactors, but we might be able to do it at lower temperature and lower energies. And so I was excited about that. The other thing that related to when we did the Big Bang debate, do you remember that? I think that was the best oh my goodness. Audience, if you want to see young Earth creationists absolutely crush the Big Bang, watch that. We even had a professional physicist who was impressed with our performance. He said, I still believe the Big Bang, but you guys won the debate. Around that time, I was looking at ways that what we call the redshift, which is evidence of the Big Bang, that it could happen through like either the plasmas or the interstellar medium. And I really one reason I wanted to go to Baylor is to study photonics, because you could use quantum mechanics. And I saw a really good paper that said, well, you could get the redshift just as these single individual photons, and you have quantum effects. It could shift it, and it would be based on the distance. You get more redshift the farther out it is. And then, of course, Rebekah and I talked about, look, there's the surface brightness test, the angular diameter test, which the Big Bang has failed, and there are a whole bunch of other things, including, and she quoted a professor at my alma mater, Johns Hopkins, Adam Rees. And there was one thing that Rees said was about the cosmological constant or dark energy. And this is in Wikipedia. It was the biggest mistake in all the history of physics because the magnitude just didn't agree. And I think Rebekah quoted that. We were just laughing. I said, that's a professor in my school, good thing they won't undo the Nobel Prize if they find out he was wrong. I mean, it's kind of sad if we lose the prestige, but I was just like, well, everything's on the table now. And so we're living in exciting times, not to mention Darwinism is absolutely going down the sewer right now because of cheap genome sequencing. So we have a lot of work to do as young earth creationists. But one thing I wanted to say, as I've watched this journey of 45 years, that's a long time. Gives you an idea how old I am. I've seen us not have the evidence. And then stuff like Mary Schweitzer discovering soft dinosaur tissue right when we might have needed something like that. We didn't have any of that. And then that changed everything. Now we have a top chemist on the planet, Marcos Eberlin, saying Mary Schweitzer does not know chemistry. It's a disgrace that she's publishing these papers saying that she discovered a mechanism to explain soft dinosaur tissue. She doesn't know chemistry. And I was like, whoa. And you're hearing that. And then James Tour saying, I know organic chemistry. I cannot explain why there's still peptide bonds there. I'm like, yeah, this is a problem in statistical mechanics and quantum chemistry. And just like, okay. And then I actually had a conversation with a professional geochronologist who works with radiometric dating. And I said, he was just pounding me for like an hour. I said, look, I have to concede. I think you have a point. I cannot refute that. But at the very end, I said, what about the chemical dates? I said, there's a problem with racemization, oxidation, alpha peptide bonds. He said, yeah, that is a serious problem. I'm like, oh, I got someone who was actually being genuinely honest. I said, I trust you now. You've acknowledged that this is a problem. And I'm like, okay, let's do more of this. There are plenty of fossils out there we could test for all of these. Some of the tests are not that expensive. It won't be just C14 tests. We could do the chemical tests. So what I'm saying, what I've seen unfold is that the case is not just changed because there's more advocacy. That's not what has changed it. The data has fallen in line. And in my published field in biology, people know me more as a biologist than an engineer, but I'm really more of an engineer than a biologist and more of a physics guy than a biologist. The genome sequencing. So just to illustrate what has happened in our field, if you could buy today a house that cost $1 million 25 years ago, but you could buy it for $1, wouldn't that be a great deal? This is what's happened in genome sequencing. The cost of sequencing an entire genome, be it human or any other creature, has dropped by a factor of 1 million. That's why I tried to give that house illustration. This is the effect that it's having on the evolution creation debate. Because what we're finding out now is we're able to test creatures before an evolutionary event or over time. And particularly Lenski's long-term evolution experiment, which has been, you talk, if I were guilty of some crime, I'd want Lenski to represent me. He was the father of this experiment because he advertises this proves evolution true. But he had at least the honesty and integrity in his scientific papers to report what actually happened, which is not exactly what he reports to the press and the people that were showering him with attention and congratulating him. Because what he actually, if you look at the data, there was tremendous amounts of gene loss. And in one of the papers where he kind of inserted his name in the author list, kind of in the middle, so you in a way that you wouldn't realize Lenski was involved, it's really kind of funny.
Let me guess, genome decays despite fitness gains?
Yes.
I've been around you too long,
Yeah,
Sal. I know all your favorite papers and quotes.
that was it. And people were saying John Sanford's terrible. He's isolated. But we read evolutionary literature. I was in a debate with someone, an evolutionary biologist, and I said, "Can you name one? Can you name one geneticist of any repute that thinks the human genome is improving?" And he just gave me that blank deer in the headlights look for like 5 seconds, and then he said, "No." And it's like, yeah, you know the deal. I know the deal. And so you have extinction, which wipes out genomes. Everyone acknowledges we're in a great extinction. We had a paper in 2013, Eugene Koonin, who's the top evolutionary biologist on the planet in terms of the number of publications and his H index. He's number one, in my opinion. And then the ID community thinks he's number one, even though he's had some disasters of things he said. On the whole, on balance, he's the best. He said genome reduction, which is loss of DNA, as the dominant mode of evolution. I'm like, whoa. How can that be? He said, well, you have the general normative way that evolution proceeds is losing towards simplification and genome reduction. I'm like, yeah, I'll buy that. That looks like but we have these unexplained episodes of punctuated by episodes of complexification with no explanation, obviously. And I'm like, gee, that at least looks like progressive creationism. But if we're interpreting the fossil record wrong, then this is totally consistent with young Earth creationism. It's devastating for Darwinian evolution for sure. And then all of our experiments. So yeah, genomes decay despite sustained fitness gains. So what's really bad about this is all this evidence that they're saying, look, we've improved fitness. It turns out, well, you're counting things like gene loss as improvement of fitness. That's exactly what you shouldn't be doing if Darwin was right. You want to see gene gain.
You got to go the other direction sometimes, guys, and it's not looking good.
You're not looking good.
I want to put this back up. So, so you're very solid green on abiogenesis, on evolution, like universal common ancestry. And then you have some down at the bottom that you're still kind of fuzzy about. And I think this is important for people to see because, you don't have to have everything figured out. And you leaned toward a direction that seemed more right according to the science.
Yes. And so they say, why are you a young Earth creationist? Not all of your blocks are green. I said, look at the trend. Look at the trend where data is pointing you. I said, it keeps flooding in. The more that I see all these scientific reports, like the James Webb Telescope. Oh my goodness, Rebekah and I spent 3 hours one time because I was so excited. I said, look at all the results. We were just laughing.
Yeah, and so and we picked a perfect time to debate the Big Bang because it was when the JWST results were coming out. And so there was a lot of problematic stuff for the Big Bang and still is. And really what we're seeing is they're trying to patch it up, but it's still hugely problematic. And so, I mean, in fact, I would say it's falsification. If this is really a scientific theory, this is falsification of it. And we've seen over and over again that every time there's a falsification of it, of a prediction, then what happens is a new entity is invented to hold it together. Dark matter, dark energy. Dark energy was invented to patch up a problem. So the problem was when Adam Rees did his calculations, he got a negative mass for the universe, which makes no sense. Well, how about questioning how about questioning why are your calculations showing that? Is it because there are too many assumptions that are wrong involved in this, rather than making up an invisible entity that we have no observation of, right? So
Exactly. And more stuff. And the climate has changed. I mean, the cultural climate. Physicists are now openly saying, hey, maybe we got all this wrong. Let's just have a big reset of all of this. And Sabina Hassenfelder was even pointing out, even they're now questioning the microwave background radiation. I mean, it's like, so when we had that debate, I think around 2023, in the intervening 2 years since today, there's been more dissension. There's been more problems coming out. And I was like, well, that was a good time to have a debate, because if we were right, you would see a trend that is favorable to us. And that's exactly what I'm seeing. And then also, to a lesser extent, quietly in physics, we've been rejecting string theory. But what I've found is there are these orthodoxies. Like I said, it reminds me of church. It's like these dogmas are thrown on you, and it's kind of disconcerting that this can happen in scientific enterprises. And that can happen when you get too theoretical, when you're not tied to the actual data, when you're making extrapolations that are not yet warranted. And so when you saw my bars and all, I'm like, look, I'm trying to give you, this is the level of what I feel comfortable empirically. If we start to have experiments that show us that we can change, we can do nuclear transformations through a process. By the way, I'm studying quantum mechanics, particularly quasi-particles. So when I was at the Evolution Conference and then my speaking tour circuit, I kept talking about quasi-particles. There is a quasi-particle that's called the heavy electron quasi-particle. It can allow, it does exist, it's been confirmed. If it can work as a proxy to muons, because we've been able to have fusion reactions at close to absolute zero. That's cold. That is really, we have cold fusion with muons. You can look this up on Wikipedia. But instead of muons, we could probably substitute these heavy electron quasi-particles. And I'm studying that. We have someone on the ID side, he's probably an old earther, named Dr. David Snoke. He's a distinguished professor of physics. He is one of the world-renowned experts on quasi-particles. I'm studying his book, which he published through Cambridge University Press. So I'm seeing also not only young earth creationism improving, but the ID crowd. Now there's so many of us. I can't believe all the university professors that are on our side, Rebekah, at least as far as ID. And they're distinguished.
ID is intelligent design for the people watching.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons I wanted to do this talk, Sal, is because there's a lot of people out there who believe that young earth creationists are only young earth creationists because they're committed to a very narrow view of what Genesis says. And so, what I'm hearing from your story is that that's not the story in your case. It's not the story in my case. I am a young earth creationist. Now I will say this, I leaned more toward it because it seems to fit better with the story in Genesis, right? But I'm not dogmatic about it. And, if I had good scientific reasons to go with old earth, okay, I would be there. Evolution for me is completely falsified, but that is on a scientific basis, meaning even if I wasn't a Christian, I would not believe in evolution because it is anti-scientific. It has been falsified. So, but with young earth creation, I do admit there's some theology there involved with it, right? Like so it is more something I'm taking on faith, but I don't think we have to do that. But we're leaning toward it because it seems like it makes the most sense in many ways.
And this is just me. And I only realized it when we had the conversation that was preparing for this show. Some of this is just pure fun for me. Rebekah said, Sal, you just love doing this. This is too fun. And I realized just now, there's a part of me that's looking at this like I would watch the Super Bowl. I just want the home team to win. This is just so much fun to see. It's like, look, there is definitely the theological side of it, which a lot of young earth creationists like Ken Ham and all would it. I'm not, that's not me. She said, "Why are you so enthused about this?" It's like, I'm rooting for the home team. I want to see us run up the score, honestly, because I was pounded so much. I was insulted so much. I got a chip on my shoulder. I said, yeah, it feels good to say I was right.
Well, but one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because there's a lot of people who started in the other direction. So they maybe grew up in a household that was teaching them young earth creation very dogmatically. And then when they kind of got let loose into the world, they were bombarded with all this evolution, old age stuff, and they basically have come to think, oh, young earth creation, it's, not scientific. And I actually have friends that are like that, and now they're just they've gone so far to the theistic evolution side. And so do you want to say anything to those people?
Absolutely. That's a symptom, and this is something I'm passionate about. That's a symptom of not getting very good arguments from the creationists. I hear them all the time, and I'm just like, of course you would feel like you've been lied to, you've been misinformed, and that the priority was proselytizing you rather than giving you facts. And I'm trying not to be too harsh, but maybe I have to be harsh. There's too much emphasis on evangelizing and getting them to believe a certain doctrinal viewpoint. I believe, so I and Dr. Sanford, we became Christians. We were still evolutionists afterward. You can be a Christian and believe in evolution. Then he became an old earth creationist. I became an old earth creationist. And then we became young life, and then young earth creationist, at least for me. And I think, it's not helpful when you have certain young earth creationists equating people who believe in evolution as being murderers and all sorts of vile things. I'm like, that's not helpful. These people could be, would they treat me like that when I became a Christian and I still believed in evolution? This is not helpful. And that drive to get conformity and, where questions are not welcomed, it's a culture where you're tempted to just cut corners and give the youth terrible arguments that when they go to university and they actually learn science, they'll realize I wasn't told the truth. They'll feel like I've been lied to. I don't want anything to do with people that lie to me, who are very dogmatic. I mean, that's how they might feel, because that's how I was feeling. And so that's what I have to say. I'm sorry that happened to you. And I don't know the remedy. And I do have one other thing to say about that. I don't like a lot of the churches in the USA anymore. They seem to be very predatory, built around the institution to get power and wealth. And I was in a lawsuit recently against an institution that I felt was siphoning millions of dollars, and we have court records. It was a nasty thing. And I said, yeah, it seems like a lot of Christianity is pushed to perpetuate institutions, not to really care about people or the truth. So you have all these hypocritical pastors that were, talking, about how to be holy and all, and then you find out they're not living the life. They're not walking, they're not walking the walk. And so, I all I could say is I can empathize with you. But the one thing that got me through is, if there's any shred that you think that Christianity or the, you may be a Christian, but you might want a little more evidence of certain things that might help you believe, or just out of curiosity, there are things like you could hear on our channel. I hope you've heard things from my perspective that you haven't heard from those creationists that you might have heard that gave you bad arguments. I hope the set of stuff that I put forward is, you would find that more, more solid, because most of what come to think of it, I don't think I've quoted the Bible in a way that said, well, you have to be a young earth creationist because this is how you should read the Bible. And I didn't do that today. I've shared the journey that I had. And like I said, it was kind of thrilling when you got a hold of knowledge you're not supposed to know and not supposed to talk about. I said, this is now fun.
And that's kind of what I want to say to people too, is if you grew up in that type of environment where you were told to believe something and then later you realize that might not be true, don't be too quick to jump to the evolution side, because you're going to find the same dogmatism over there. So in fact, maybe even more, right? And a lot of people do, just like they get intellectually bullied. Like basically, and I encounter this every single day, every comment on my channel, it's bullying, where it's like, you'll get told you don't accept science, or you're ignorant, or basically like it just trying to make you feel like this is evolution and the old ages, it's an established fact, and if you don't believe it, then you're just something's wrong with you.
I have seen, regrettably, a lot of dogmatism in creationism. And it's like, what do you mean, Sal? Okay, so this is really funny. I'll give an anecdote. I said that Dr. Sanford's book, who I was working for at the time, I said it needs some updating. His definition of fitness needs to be modified. I got an earful from some guy at CMI, and he started writing Dr. Sanford saying Sal's of the, of the Darwinist, or I don't know what it was just terrible, trying to get me fired. And this is ridiculous, because Dr. Sanford and I were having those conversations. I said, look, the book he published in 2004, we later published in 2021. We had a joint publication in a secular venue, Springer Nature. Our chapter was published in a book that retails for $1,500. It's on university library shelves. But the reason I pointed that out, I couldn't even just mention that maybe Genetic Entropy, 2004 book, needed some revision. And all the dogmatism that was there, it's like, you're a heretic. You're a heretic. And then there are different views for the explanation of how to solve distant starlight. I said, I started to point out there's problems with Maxwell's equations. You have to resolve that. You're a heretic, Sal. I'm just like, guys, this is crazy. We're supposed to be all on the same team. Just because I don't think maybe your arguments are good, I'm suddenly labeled a heretic. So, I'm sorry if you're seeing some bitterness here. I don't want to go to creationist conferences. I'll give you a good example. I wanted to talk about the patterns of similarity and differences, the nested hierarchy that is so talked about as evidence of evolution. I have argued that this is intelligently designed nested hierarchies, because there are codes in it that when we run it through a computer, it helps us predict protein folds. And they're actually, I said, God has intelligently designed all this. And I'd been working on a paper to show that. It's something called, for the aficionados out there, it's direct coupling analysis, K-modes algorithms. You would know that if you're in the field. It's a very specialized field. Well, anyway, the Creation Research Society said, no, you can't present on this. Sorry, but thank you for your submission. 3 months later, we published in Oxford University Press, and I was just laughing. I said, a secular venue valued us, and a pretty good one, in structural bioinformatics. But the creationists were like, we're not interested. And so, yeah, I get your frustration if you're an ex-creationist. The culture is mean, and then there's all these scandals that are going on that are not very pleasant, and then you have the church. So I get it. That's all I could say is, maybe what we've done today is just maybe to give you a little different look on things. And I particularly emphasize stuff that we got from the secular, the data. I haven't been I don't know that I really cited one creationist point, except maybe John Sanford, who's also a secular scientist of great repute. So anything he says, you can consider him in both camps. So I hope that will change some of you. I have a passion for this also because, like as I said, I've been through it. Being a science student and being a creationist can be very, very difficult and challenging. And there are times you'll learn stuff in school that'll just make you like, I don't know that I could believe this. And so hence, I also had a few there where I said, they're not all green yet. I'm right there with you. And my encouragement is, hey, well, look, just chill. Maybe you don't have to decide this today. Just live your life, try to live. Maybe you'll get an answer tomorrow. But if you can find reasons to just live out your life well, and it's never some of these issues are not ever personally resolved, is that going to change anything for you ultimately? I mean, some creationists are like, oh, you're of the devil if you don't believe in your earth creationism. I'm just like, look, the priorities that are laid out in the Testament are for Christian living. Not all of us are there's probably very few of us that'll ever get all the theological points right. So I'm not one of those kind of creationists. I will say, though, that evolution it just fails scientifically. There's no reason to put trust in it. Now, there is one point that there are 2 points that I really wrestled with, and let me share that if that's okay. The problem of evil. Very short. I said, well, look, you have an intelligent designer. And by the way, Darwin, that was one of the reasons he came up with his theory. He said he tried to reconcile the appearance of design and also the problem of evil. So his answer was, well, so-called natural selection explains the problem of design and also the problem of evil. Well, since his theory is wrong, it's like that sort of falls apart. So how did I deal, and it's only like in the last 7 years, with the problem of evil? Because the number one thing I get from people that are thoughtful, why they don't believe in intelligent design or creationists, is like, well, okay, if God is so smart and so powerful, why does he let all this evil happen? So I'll give an indirect answer to that. And I realize that the direct answer is 2 Corinthians 4:17. This momentary light affliction is building for us an eternal way to glory far beyond all comparison. Now that was pretty thick. Even people that read it don't necessarily comprehend what it means. But I once read the entire story of Snow White to my creationist study. I spent 10 minutes reading the story. So Snow White, this beautiful girl, her queen mother dies. She gets a wicked stepmother to be her stepmother. And stepmother's jealous of Snow White's beauty. Stepmother kills Snow White. But then the prince comes along. Snow White is resurrected. The evil queen is destroyed, and they live happily ever after. That's a summary, but when you read the actual story or you watch the 1937 Snow White story, you're just very compelled. And I say, okay, what would happen? Would the happy ending be as meaningful or as beautiful if there were no evil queen? And I asked my study, all of them said, no. I said, DC, that's the answer to the problem of evil. Snow White's resurrected. They live happily ever after. Doesn't that sound like something you've heard in the Bible? That everything is made sense. Every bad thing can be made sense of if there was a resurrection event and then there's eternal life. All this momentary light affliction now has meaning. And that kind of put a lot of peace in I said, this addresses what Darwin couldn't solve. He just saw all the, he had 3 children that died. So I'm not trying to diss on him. I mean, he went through tragedy. All of us will suffer this. So that's one. That was the big one. That was the big one is dealing with the problem of evil. And that's usually the biggest hang up. So
what about divine hiddenness?
Oh my goodness, thank you for asking.
I just thought, okay, what would be the other point that Sal would want to address?
Divine hiddenness. So Proverbs 25:2. It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. It's the glory of kings to search out a matter. We are on a big detective mission. And on some level, it's like an Easter egg hunt. There's drama there. And there's difficulty with divine hiddenness. It raises theological questions that I'm not going to try to attempt to answer here. But if we take that verse, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, it's the glory of kings to search out. I'm like, wouldn't you want to make your presence just so blatantly obvious that everyone would believe? And the Bible teaches no, that's not the way he wants to do business. But just
you're a king, Sal.
Yeah, we're kings.
You searched out the matter.
This is the greatest adventure for us. That he's hidden it from us for us to discover. And in the 21st century, with all the instruments and all the magnificent science, we're starting to see, to me, it's affirming one, we're created, intelligently designed on so many levels of organization, from all the galaxies down to the atoms. I mean, you hear the physicists saying this, so many of them, even those who aren't believers in much of anything, they're like, this is just wonderful. Even atheist Fred Hoyle, he said, some super intellect designed all this. He was an atheist. But he said, it seems to, the matter is just beyond question. It's amazing. Now he became sort of a pantheist. Maybe the whole universe is intelligent, But so the divine hiddenness. Well, the answer I got was when I looked at what it says in the Gospels. Many will not find life. That narrow is the way, difficult is the path that leads to life. Wide is the gate, and easy is the path that leads to destruction. And this is where it gets a little unpleasant. It's like, well, why would God allow that? And the answer is in Deuteronomy 13, chapter 13, verses 1-3. People are going to the promised land, and he allows all these false prophets to come in. You're like, well, that's kind of mean. That kind of reminds me of the Garden of Eden, where he builds this beautiful garden, and then he lets this snake and devil come in. Well, why would you do that? Well, Deuteronomy chapter 13 says, for the Lord your God is testing you to see whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. He'll make it really, really, if you don't want anything to do with God, and there have been people that have said they would rather go to hell than serve God, and they're like, okay, well, and they were nice about telling me that. I was actually shocked that they would say that. God is making it really easy for people that want nothing to do with him to be able to turn their back and their eyes and close to the evidence. But for those who are willing to seek the things that he's hidden, yes, treasures. For the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. So if you're looking for reassurance, there's plenty of stuff to find in science. And thank you for bringing that up, Rebekah. Now I remember what I really wanted to tell, in addition to these other things. So we have very similar to chimpanzees. I get a little bit disconcerted. I mean, physically, we can argue about the percent difference. And Casey Luskin, I need to give him credit for this. He said, okay, so if you asked an evolutionist, how different would you have to be before they would dismiss that you have a common ancestor? And he said, they say we're 50% similar to a banana. I said, so there's no number. Doesn't matter how big the difference is, they're going to still insist on common ancestry. So I've been trying to tell creationists, stop trying to just, you're straining at gnats, letting camels through. It's like, so what if it's 1% versus 15%? We're very similar. I know that. And because I had an intern over the summer, I was teaching her bioinformatics. I said, look, Katie, and you could see this whole thing on my other YouTube channel, Evidence Reasons Academy. She's a biology student. She's now a senior. She's in school. And I said, look, Katie, you're going to see this when you start doing going through genetic databases. You're going to see stuff like the p53 protein. There's segments of it were 100% identical. I've seen it. So this is very troubling to a creationist. They're like, well, the sentiment is, well, I can believe in common design, but why would God deceive us this way? It'd be easy if we were just humans and there were just everything else was tin, then you would have no problem. If all the chemicals were just so different, then we would definitely think we were created instantaneously. And I the answer came to me. I said, as a young Earth creationist, it still troubled me until I was at the NIH and I was taking a class in cellular neuroscience, and they, we all had term projects to do, and assigned to me was the tetrameric structure of some ion channel. And I said, and they assigned a postdoctoral fellow to shepherd us. And I asked the postdoctoral fellow, I said, this is really cool how they figured this out. Where did they get this cell? They said, these are embryonic stem cells. My heart sunk. Someone died and we're harvesting their cells and we're doing all these experiments. And they're selling her body parts all over the internet for a few $100. It just crushed me. And I said, we don't have to do this. We have chimpanzees. We have I said, when we test pharmaceuticals, we test them on mice. I'm like, aren't you going to thank God every day that he made creatures that can die in our place so that we may be healed? And I was like, gee, that does sound like something I've heard in the Bible. In the Old Testament, these creatures, there's a picture there. They die in your place. Your sins are atoned. And then there's like the Lamb of God, by his stripes you're healed. It's like this theme is just like so like all over the place. You cannot live unless you consume food, and basically other creatures die so that you can live. I mean, this is throughout all biology. Humans are alive because something dies that's innocent. And now even in the medical profession, I said, do you not get it? You're going to thank God every day. We're so similar to chimpanzees if you saw some of the cruel experiments we do on all these model organisms. And so I'd like, okay, now I have peace over the issue. God wasn't being deceptive. He's being extremely gracious. And then also, it's easier to study these organisms like the nematode and bacteria. We learned the genetic code by studying bacteria. Thank God we could just play with bacteria to figure out what the genetic code was. We learn about neuroscience by studying all these other creatures, and it escapes me at the moment what they are, but there's just these, I think, squids. We study squids, we can learn how our nerves work. Now, isn't that really fascinating? It's like all these little model organisms were made there just for us. So, well, you get all this stuff about nested hierarchy. Why would God, be deceptive? I'm like, there are two problems there. First off, coevolution is going to be a nightmare. And if you want to indulge me, I can briefly show you the problem. Okay, on the left, you see a kid's toy. Do you see how it's like this 3D puzzle?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, on the right, you have also the 3D puzzle. That's a polycomb repression complex. Do you see how well everything has to fit to work?
Yeah.
We could explore this. How do you co-evolve this? You have to evolve one thing to make the other thing fit. And the other thing is, across species, the connections are a little different between the way something connects in one species is not the same in the other. Coevolution is a nightmare for evolution. Even evolutionary biologists don't even know how to ask the question, much less try to answer it. This is an indication of common design. See, that only took 3 minutes. And Dr. Dan said, that's a really interesting idea. I said, why don't you go to an evolution conference and present on that? And I'm interested to hear what they're going to say. I presented on something else, but that was the impetus. He was so fascinated by that problem. And I know it kind of, it's like, that was pretty good, Sal. I got to admit, that was kind of clever. It was like, yeah. And I know when I give this talk to faculty and deans who are on our side, they're like, yeah, Sal, you're definitely right. This is a serious problem. And they actually, when they hear what evolutionists say, when they talk about co-evolving nested hierarchies, they just laugh. They said that has to be designed. So, and then in my thing that published in Oxford University Press, that code, the nested hierarchy generated the code that helps us figure out protein folds. I said, there are levels of design. I can actually see it at the sequence data, also the coevolution here, and then we can be grateful for the nested hierarchy because we have these model organisms that are like us. And this is a gift of God. You'll never hate nested hierarchies after that. And that's what I really wanted to say. So there you go.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, Sal, and your whole journey. I want to put it back up one more time. Your journey from evolution to young earth creation. I hope this has blessed some people, and me and Sal are very passionate about fighting against evolution, but at the same time, we are not saying that you have to disbelieve in evolution to believe in God. God loves you, and that's our true heart, is that people would know God and know his love, just whatever they end up believing about origins.